Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In the small, fog-shrouded town of Elmswood, there was a single street light that stood at the end of Willow Lane. It was old, its iron post weathered with rust, and its glass lampshade often coated with dust. Unlike the other streetlights in town that flickered in and out of service, this one never failed. It burned with a warm golden glow, steady and soft, no matter the weather. But there was something strange about this streetlight, something the townsfolk rarely spoke of, but knew deep down in their bones. It never cast a shadow. Willow Lane was a quiet cul-de-sac, lined with trees that arched over the road like the ribs of a giant beast. Few people lived there now, and even fewer visited. The road led nowhere, dead-ending in a patch of overgrown forest. Yet every so often, stories would surface, stories about the streetlight and what happened beneath its golden glow. It guides the lost, old Mrs. Hawthorne, the town historian, would whisper to anyone brave enough to ask about it. The spirits of those who can't find their way, it leads them home. When pressed for details, she would grow quiet, her gaze distant. Not all who are guided by the light belong to this world. Miriam Crane moved to Elmswood on a cold autumn morning, seeking peace after years of turmoil. She had lost her husband in a tragic car accident the year before, and the grief had consumed her. She hoped the small town, with its quiet streets and friendly faces, would offer her a fresh start. She rented a small house on Willow Lane, drawn to its solitude and the towering oak trees that lined the street. The house was old, with creaky floors and drafty windows, but she found its imperfections comforting. The streetlight at the end of the lane caught her eye on her first night there. As she unpacked her boxes, she glanced out the window and saw its steady glow cutting through the swirling fog. It seemed oddly comforting, like a beacon in the darkness. One night, unable to sleep, Miriam took a walk down the lane. The air was crisp, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. She found herself drawn to the streetlight, its warm glow piercing the shadows of the night. As she approached, she noticed something peculiar. The air around the light felt different, warmer, almost alive. And then she saw him. A man stood beneath the streetlight, his figure barely more than a silhouette. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a coat with tails, a wide-brimmed hat, and he seemed lost, his gaze darting nervously around. "Hello," Miriam called out hesitantly. The man turned to her, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw sadness in his eyes. But then he smiled, a soft, wistful smile, and tipped his hat. "Thank you," he said, his voice faint, like the rustling of dry leaves. Before Miriam could respond, the man stepped into the light and vanished. Miriam returned home shaken but intrigued. The man had seemed so real, yet she couldn't deny what she had seen, or rather what she hadn't. He had disappeared without a trace, as though he had walked into another world. The next day, she visited the library and sought out Mrs. Hawthorne. "The streetlight?" the old woman said, her eyes narrowing. "Ah, so you've seen them." "Them? The spirits," Mrs. Hawthorne explained. "They come to the light when they're ready to move on. It guides them to where they need to go. Some call it a blessing, others—" She trailed off, her expression darkening. "What?" Miriam pressed. "Others say it's a curse, that once you see the light's true purpose, it never leaves you alone." Over the next few weeks, Miriam kept a close eye on the streetlight. Almost every night she would see figures beneath it. Men, women, even children. They all had the same lost look in their eyes, the same tentative steps as they approached the light. She began to notice patterns. The spirits often lingered, looking around as if searching for someone or something. Then, just as before, they would step into the light and disappear. One night, she saw a woman in a tattered dress cradling a baby. The woman glanced up at Miriam's window, her expression desperate. Unable to ignore the plea in her eyes, Miriam went outside. "Can I help you?" she asked softly. The woman didn't respond but held out the baby, her hands trembling. Miriam hesitated, then reached out to take the child. The moment her fingers brushed the baby's blanket, the woman smiled, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered before stepping into the light and vanishing. Miriam looked down, but the baby was gone. As the weeks turned into months, Miriam's life became intertwined with the streetlight. She couldn't explain why, but she felt responsible for the spirits that appeared beneath it. She began keeping a journal, recording their appearances and trying to piece together their stories. She learned that some spirits needed more than the light to find peace. A man in a soldier's uniform appeared one night, clutching a letter. He stared at her, his eyes filled with anguish. Miriam took the letter from him, and he vanished. The next day, she found the address on the envelope and delivered it to a woman in town. The letter was dated 1944, and the woman broke down in tears when she read it. "He never came home," she said, "but now I know he loved me." One night, Miriam found herself standing beneath the streetlight, staring up at its golden glow. The fog swirled around her, and the air felt heavy with expectation. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why did you choose me?" The light flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she heard a voice. "Because you are lost too." The words sent a chill through her. Was it true? Had her grief for her husband tethered her to the light, just as it tethered the spirits? The next night, as the clock struck midnight, Miriam saw a figure beneath the streetlight that made her heart stop. It was her husband, Daniel. He looked just as she remembered, his dark hair tousled, his eyes warm and kind. He smiled at her, but there was sadness in his expression. "Daniel," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've been waiting," he said softly, "but it's time for me to go now." "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm not ready to say goodbye." "You already have," he said. "You just don't realize it yet. The light chose you because it knew you'd understand. You helped them move on, but you can't help me. Not yet." Before she could respond, he stepped into the light and vanished. Miriam stayed on Willow Lane, becoming the unofficial keeper of the streetlight. She guided the spirits who appeared, helping them find peace in whatever way she could. And though the light's burden was heavy, she carried it willingly, knowing that in some way it brought her closer to Daniel. Because as long as the streetlight burned, she knew she wasn't truly alone. The first time Emma dreamed of the playground, she was 7 years old. It wasn't like any playground she had ever seen. The sky above was a rich violet with no sun or moon, just a soft, ambient light that made everything glow. The grass was a deep emerald green, the kind you'd see in a storybook, and the equipment, swings, slides, monkey bars, seemed to shimmer faintly, as though they were not entirely real. She remembered stepping onto the playground barefoot, the grass cool against her toes, and feeling an overwhelming sense of wonder. Everything was perfect, from the gentle breeze to the faint sound of laughter echoing in the distance. But there was no one there. When she woke the next morning, she told her mother about it. "I had a dream about a playground," she said, her voice full of excitement. "It was so beautiful, Mom. I want to go back." Her mother smiled indulgently. "It sounds lovely, sweetheart. Maybe you'll dream about it again." And she did. For years, the playground appeared in Emma's dreams, always the same but slightly different. Sometimes the swings would be moving on their own, creaking softly in the dreamlike breeze. Other times, the slide would glisten as though freshly polished, beckoning her to climb its ladder. The dreams weren't frequent, but they were vivid. She might dream of the playground once every few months, And whenever she did, she woke feeling both delighted and wistful, as though she had visited an old friend. The strange thing was, she could never remember playing. She would walk around, touch the cold metal of the monkey bars or the soft rubber seats of the swings, but she never climbed or swung. Something always held her back, though she could never explain why. And there was always that sound, the faint, distant laughter. It sounded like children playing, but she never saw anyone else there. By the time Emma was 13, she had stopped talking about the playground. She assumed it was just one of those things that happened in childhood, a whimsical dream her mind liked to revisit. But one day, while at lunch with her best friend Lily, the topic came up unexpectedly. "I had the weirdest dream last night," Lily said, poking at her sandwich. "There was this playground, but it wasn't normal. It felt magical or something." Emma froze. "What did it look like?" Lily tilted her head, thinking. "The grass was super green, like brighter than it should be, and the sky was purple. There was this slide that looked shiny, and I think I heard laughing, but I didn't see anyone." Emma felt her stomach drop. "That's my dream," she whispered. Lily looked at her confused. "What do you mean?" Emma explained everything, her voice shaking with excitement and fear. When she finished, Lily stared at her, wide-eyed. "So, you've been dreaming about it too?" Emma nodded. "Do you think it's real?" Lily asked. Emma didn't know what to say. Over the next few years, Emma discovered that more people had dreamed of the playground. Through casual conversations or late-night confessions at sleepovers, she began to piece together a strange truth. The playground wasn't just hers. There were small differences in the details people remembered. Some said they saw seesaws. Others remembered a merry-go-round that Emma had never seen. But the overall description was always the same: the vibrant grass, the purple sky, the laughter. No one ever saw anyone else in the dream, but they all reported the same feeling, a mix of joy and unease. By the time Emma was 16, she had heard of at least a dozen people who had dreamed of the playground. And then something even stranger happened. Emma hadn't dreamed of the playground in nearly a year when it returned, but this time it was different. The vibrant colors seemed duller, the equipment rusted and worn. The swings no longer moved in the breeze, and the slide was covered in faint cracks. For the first time, she felt scared. The laughter was still there, but it sounded distorted, as though coming from underwater. When she woke up, she couldn't shake the dream. She called Lily, desperate to talk about it. "Lily," she said, "did you dream of the playground last night?" There was a long pause. Then Lily whispered, "It was different this time, wasn't it?" Emma's heart sank. Over the next few weeks, others who had dreamed of the playground reported the same thing. It was falling apart. The laughter had turned eerie. The once magical place was decaying, and no one understood why. One night, Emma dreamed of the playground again. This time it was barely recognizable. The grass was brown and patchy, the sky a murky gray. The swings were gone, and the slide had collapsed into a heap of twisted metal. For the first time, she heard voices, not laughter, but whispers. They came from all around her, soft and urgent, but she couldn't make out the words. And then, as she stood in the center of the playground, everything began to fade. The grass, the equipment, even the sky dissolved into darkness. She was left standing in a void, alone. When she woke up, she knew it was gone. Emma couldn't let it go. She spent months researching dreams, lucid dreaming, and shared dream phenomena. She scoured online forums, hoping to find others who had dreamed of the playground. Eventually, she stumbled upon a thread titled, "Have you seen the playground?" It was filled with people describing the same dream: the glowing playground, the purple sky, the laughter. Some had dreamed of it as children, others as adults. A few mentioned its decay and eventual disappearance. One comment stood out. It was from a user named LostChild89. I think the playground is where souls go when they're in between. It's a liminal space, a place for the lost to gather. But something is wrong. Maybe too many of us found it, and now it's breaking. Or maybe it was never meant to last. Emma didn't dream of the playground for years. By the time she was in her 30s, she had almost convinced herself it had been a strange coincidence, a shared quirk of the human mind. Then one night, it returned. She was standing in a void, but this time, there was no equipment, no grass, no sky. Only the faint echo of laughter, fading like a distant memory. And then she saw them. Children, dozens of them, appeared one by one, their forms shimmering like ghosts. They looked at her with wide, pleading eyes. "Help us," one of them whispered. Emma's breath caught. "I don't know how," she said, tears streaming down her face. The children began to fade, their voices growing fainter. "Don't forget us," one of them said before the void swallowed them completely. Emma never dreamed of the playground again, but she couldn't forget what she had seen. She dedicated her life to studying dreams, writing books, and giving lectures about the phenomenon of shared dreaming. To this day, people come forward with stories of a magical playground that appears in their dreams, though most say it's fleeting, vanishing before they can fully explore it. And while Emma can't say for sure what the playground truly was, she knows one thing. It was real in some way that defied explanation. Perhaps it was a place for the lost, or perhaps it was a piece of another world, slipping into theirs for just a moment before vanishing forever. The wind chime hung on the porch of a crumbling farmhouse at the edge of town, swaying gently even when the air was perfectly still. Its chimes were delicate, thin slivers of bone, strung together with silver wire that gleamed like moonlight. No one in the quiet village of Raven's Hollow knew who had hung it there or when it had first appeared, but the stories about it had passed down for generations. The elders whispered warnings to children who dared stray too close. Don't let the chime sing. Its song calls to those who have been left behind. Of course, such warnings only fueled curiosity, especially for someone like Clara, a headstrong young woman with a fascination for the macabre. The stories about the wind chime were as old as Raven's Hollow itself. Some claimed it was a relic from the days when witches roamed the woods, a tool used to summon spirits and bind them to this world. Others said it was cursed, created by a grieving widow who couldn't bear to let her husband's spirit move on. But the most common tale was that of the Forgotten Souls, a group of townsfolk who had vanished without explanation one cold winter night over a century ago. They were farmers, blacksmiths, mothers, children, ordinary people who had simply disappeared, leaving behind empty homes and unanswered questions. It was said that the wind chime, when rung, called these souls back, but their return was never joyful. "They're not who they used to be," Mrs. Alden, the town's oldest resident, once said. "When you call to them, they come back empty, shadows of what they were, and they'll never leave you alone again." Clara didn't believe in ghosts. At 22, she considered herself too practical for such things, though she loved reading about folklore and old legends. The wind chime was just another story to her, a curious artifact with a dark history that begged to be explored. One chilly autumn afternoon, Clara decided to visit the old farmhouse where the wind chime still hung. The house had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. But the chime remained pristine, untouched by time. As Clara approached, the chime swayed gently, its hollow tones ringing out despite the still air. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment, she thought she heard something beneath the chime's melody, a faint whisper, soft and distant. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, only the eerie song of the wind chime. Unable to resist, Clara reached out and touched the chime. The bone fragments were cold against her fingers. and the silver wire hummed faintly as if alive. She gave it a soft push, and the chime began to sway more forcefully, its song filling the air. The melody was haunting, each note resonating deep in her chest. And then the world grew quiet. The wind stopped, the birds stopped chirping, even the rustle of leaves seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of the chime. "Who calls to us?" a voice whispered. Clara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Standing at the edge of the porch was a figure, a man in tattered clothing, his face pale and his eyes hollow. Behind him, more figures began to appear, their forms shimmering like heat waves. "Who are you?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are the forgotten," the man said. "You have called us back." Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding. She hadn't meant to summon anyone. She didn't even believe it was possible. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The man tilted his head, his empty eyes locking onto hers. "Once called, we cannot return," he said. "You must carry us with you." Before Clara could respond, the figures began to move toward her, their forms flickering like candlelight. She tried to run, but the moment one of them touched her, a searing cold shot through her body, and everything went dark. When Clara woke, she was back in her own bed, the events of the previous day feeling like a strange, vivid dream. But the cold, hollow feeling in her chest told her it had been real. At first, the changes were subtle. She began to hear whispers when she was alone, faint voices that seemed to come from the corners of her room. Shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, and no matter how bright the day, she always felt as though she were being watched. The figures from the farmhouse were with her now, their ghostly forms appearing at night, standing silently in the corners of her room or watching her from across the street. "Why won't you leave me alone?" she cried one night, her voice breaking. The man from the farmhouse appeared beside her bed, his face as pale as moonlight. "You called us back," he said. "Now we are bound to you." Desperate to rid herself of the spirits, Clara began researching the wind chime and its history. She visited the local library, pored over old journals, and even consulted with Mrs. Alden. "The chime binds them to this world," Mrs. Alden explained, "but the bond can be broken." "How?" Clara asked. "You must destroy the chime," the old woman said. "But beware. Breaking it is dangerous. The souls will not go quietly, and they may take you with them." Armed with this knowledge, Clara returned to the farmhouse. The wind chime was still there, swaying gently in the still air. The spirits appeared as soon as she stepped onto the porch, their hollow eyes watching her intently. "You cannot break it," the man said. "We will not let you." Clara ignored him, grabbing a large rock from the ground. She raised it high, ready to smash the chime, but the spirits lunged at her. The air grew icy as they surrounded her, their cold hands clawing at her arms and legs. For a moment she thought she would lose consciousness, but she summoned all her strength and brought the rock down with a deafening crash. The wind chime shattered, its pieces scattering across the porch. The spirits let out a collective wail, their forms flickering wildly before dissolving into the air, and then everything was silent. For weeks after, Clara felt like a part of her was missing, as though the spirits had taken a piece of her soul with them. The farmhouse remained empty, the wind chime gone, and the strange stillness of the place finally lifted. But sometimes late at night, Clara still hears the faint echo of the wind chime's haunting melody carried on the breeze, and she wonders if the spirits are truly gone, or if they're waiting for her to call them back once more. The legend of the ballroom began long before anyone alive could remember. Perched atop the cliffs of Ravencroft Manor, the grand estate had once been the jewel of a bygone era. Its walls were adorned with gilded mirrors, its floors polished to a mirror shine, and its ballroom was the crown jewel of all, an expanse of marble and crystal that seemed to glitter with its own light. But no one visited it anymore. No one dared, for it was said that once you entered the ballroom and the music began to play, you would never leave. Sophia had always been curious about Ravencroft Manor. As a child, she had grown up in the nearby village, hearing hushed whispers about the estate and its cursed ballroom. The old stories told of a grand gala held there a century ago. The finest musicians had been hired, the most dazzling gowns had been worn, and the wealthiest families had gathered for an evening of splendor. But when the clock struck midnight, the doors to the ballroom locked. The music played on, and the dancers twirled and swayed, unable to stop. Days passed, then weeks, but no one inside could leave. When the doors finally opened months later, the room was empty, save for the faint sound of an unseen orchestra. The ballroom had stood abandoned ever since, its legend growing darker with every passing year. Sophia, however, wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. At 27, she was a historian, a researcher who had built a career on uncovering the truths behind myths and folklore. When she heard that Ravencroft Manor was up for auction, her curiosity burned brighter than her caution. She convinced the estate's new owner to let her explore the manor, with a particular interest in the infamous ballroom. Sophia arrived at the manor on a crisp autumn morning, the wind whipping her scarf as she stood before its grand doors. The new owner, a businessman named Mr. Halstead, handed her the keys with a skeptical look. "Be careful," he warned. "The locals refuse to come near this place. They say the ballroom is still active." Sophia smiled politely. "I don't scare easily, Mr. Halstead." She stepped inside, the air cold and heavy with the scent of decay. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped like curtains from the chandeliers. But despite its state of ruin, the manor retained a haunting beauty, as though it were waiting for its next grand event. The ballroom was exactly as she had imagined, vast, elegant, and eerily pristine. The marble floor was unmarked by time, the crystal chandeliers sparkled as if freshly cleaned, and the gilded mirrors along the walls reflected a room that seemed untouched by the years. But the silence was oppressive, as though the room were holding its breath. Sophia unpacked her equipment, a camera, notebooks, and a small recorder. She began documenting the room, taking careful notes about its architecture and design. As she stood in the center of the ballroom, she couldn't help but feel watched, though she knew she was alone. Then, as she examined a particularly ornate mirror, a soft sound filled the air. It was faint at first, barely audible, a single violin note, long and mournful. Sophia froze, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, joined by the deep hum of a cello and the soft whisper of a piano. Music. She turned toward the center of the room, but there was no orchestra, no musicians. The sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And then she saw them. Reflected in the mirrors were dancers, men and women in elegant gowns and tailored suits, their faces pale and expressionless. They twirled and spun across the marble floor, their movements graceful yet mechanical, as though they were marionettes on invisible strings. Sophia whipped around, expecting to see them behind her, but the room was empty. Only in the mirrors did the dancers exist, their silent faces staring back at her as they moved in perfect synchrony. The music grew louder, filling every corner of the room. Sophia tried to move toward the door, but her feet wouldn't obey. Instead, they stepped forward, drawn toward the center of the ballroom. "No," she whispered, struggling against the invisible force. But her body betrayed her, her arms lifting as though guided by an unseen partner. She spun, her feet gliding effortlessly across the marble floor, and in the mirrors, she saw herself join the spectral dancers. The moment she entered their ranks, the world shifted. The air grew warm, the chandeliers blazed with golden light, and the room was suddenly alive with people. The once abandoned ballroom was now filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of champagne glasses. But something was wrong. The dancers around her smiled, but their eyes were empty. Their movements were flawless but unnatural, their limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Sophia felt her own body moving in perfect time with the music, though she had no control. "You shouldn't have come," a voice whispered in her ear. The voice belonged to a man dressed in a black suit, his face gaunt and his eyes shadowed. He danced beside her, his grip cold as ice. "Who are you?" Sophia managed to ask, her voice trembling. "One of many," he replied. "We were invited here long ago, and now we cannot leave. Neither can you." Sophia's heart raced. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. Around her, the other dancers began to move faster, their movements growing more erratic. The music swelled, frantic and dissonant, as though the orchestra itself were unraveling. "There must be a way out," she said desperately. The man's hollow eyes met hers. "The dance must end, but it never does. Not unless someone stops the music." Sophia realized what she had to do. As the man spun her toward the edge of the room, she spotted the grand piano near the far wall. Its keys moved on their own, the invisible pianist playing with feverish intensity. With all her strength, she broke free from her partner's grip and ran toward the piano. The dancers turned toward her in unison, their heads snapping unnaturally, their empty eyes fixed on her. "Stop her!" one of them hissed, their voice a distorted shriek. Sophia reached the piano and slammed the lid down on the keys. The music stopped abruptly, the sudden silence deafening. The dancers froze, their bodies trembling. One by one, they began to dissolve into wisps of smoke, their faces fading into expressions of relief. The ballroom darkened, the chandeliers flickering before going out completely. Sophia collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. When Sophia awoke, she was lying on the grass outside the manor. The sun was rising, its golden light washing over the crumbling estate. The ballroom's windows were dark and silent, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the manor was gone. Sophia never returned to Ravencroft Manor, but she couldn't forget what she had seen. She published her account of the cursed ballroom, though few believed her story. And yet, every now and then, someone would report hearing faint music coming from the abandoned manor. A waltz that seemed to echo on the wind, calling for its next dancers. On the outskirts of a forgotten village where the forest grew dense and the mist lingered well past dawn, there stood an ancient inn called the Hollow Hearth. The inn was known for its peculiar history and its peculiar guests, but most of all, it was known for the lantern that hung from its porch. Unlike any ordinary lantern, its glow was not warm or inviting. Instead, it shone with an otherworldly, pale blue light that danced eerily in the dark. But what truly set it apart were the shadows it cast, shadows that belonged not to the living, but to those who had long departed from this world. The innkeeper, a man named Elias, had inherited the Hollow Hearth from his mother, who had inherited it from her mother before her. For as long as Elias could remember, the lantern had always hung in its place, swaying gently in the breeze even when the air was still. His mother had often warned him, "Never light the lantern unless it is needed, and when it is lit, listen carefully, for the shadows have stories to tell." Elias had heeded her advice for years, keeping the lantern dark and undisturbed, but his curiosity had always burned brighter than the lantern ever could. One stormy night, when the inn was empty of guests and the wind howled through the rafters, Elias found himself drawn to the lantern. He had spent hours by the fire, reading an old journal his mother had kept, an account of the lantern and its peculiar powers. According to her notes, the lantern's flame was said to summon the shadows of those who had died nearby, allowing them to appear and communicate with the living. It was a tool of the lost, she had written, a bridge between the living and the dead. But it came with a cost. Elias stared at the lantern for a long time, the journal's final words echoing in his mind. The shadows never leave willingly. His fingers itched with temptation, and before he could second-guess himself, he struck a match and lit the lantern. The pale blue light flickered to life, casting a faint glow across the inn's porch. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The light danced on the walls and floor, casting long shadows that shifted and swayed. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Elias saw movement. Shadows that didn't align with the empty chairs or the hanging ferns. One by one they appeared. Figures that stood in the lantern's glow, their forms dark and indistinct, like smudges on a fogged mirror. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, their outlines flickering as though caught between worlds. Elias took a step back, his heart pounding. Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The shadows didn't speak, but they moved closer, their gestures deliberate. One shadow, a tall, gaunt figure, lifted an arm and pointed toward the edge of the forest. Another, smaller and more delicate, seemed to bow its head, as if in mourning. Elias suddenly understood what his mother had meant. These shadows weren't just apparitions, they were memories, echoes of the dead, trying to communicate. As the night deepened, the shadows began to shift, their movements more urgent. They flickered and swayed, forming shapes and patterns that Elias struggled to interpret. But amidst their silent dance, a faint whisper filled the air, a voice carried by the lantern's unnatural light. "Help us," the voice said, barely audible over the wind. Elias's blood ran cold. "How? What do you need?" The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "The forest, the well, release us." Elias frowned. The forest near the inn was dense and forbidding, its paths overgrown and tangled with roots. He had heard rumors of an old well hidden deep within it, a place where travelers had vanished over the years. Before he could ask another question, the shadows began to retreat, fading into the walls and floor, until only the pale blue glow of the lantern remained. The next morning, Elias prepared himself for the journey. Armed with a lantern of his own and a sturdy walking stick, he ventured into the forest, following the vague directions the shadows had conveyed. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The forest was eerily silent, save for the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. After hours of searching, he found it, the well. It was old and crumbling, its stones covered in moss and ivy. The air around it was heavy, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Elias peered into the well, its depths shrouded in darkness. As he leaned closer, the lantern in his hand flickered, casting long shadows across the stones. "Release us!" The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing from the depths of the well. Elias realized what he had to do. The lantern on the inn's porch wasn't just a tool for summoning shadows. It was a vessel, a prison for the souls of those who had died without peace. The well, he understood, was their anchor, the place where their lives had ended. With trembling hands, he placed his lantern on the edge of the well and lit it. The blue flame flared to life, brighter than he had ever seen it. The shadows began to rise from the well, their forms twisting and writhing as they emerged. They surrounded him, dozens of them, their dark shapes swirling in the lantern's glow. For a moment, he felt the weight of their grief, their longing, their desperation to be free. And then, one by one, they vanished into the light, their whispers fading into silence. When Elias returned to the inn, the lantern on the porch was dark. Its flame had extinguished, and its glass panes were cracked, as though the strain of releasing the souls had been too great. But the inn felt different. The heavy, oppressive air that had hung over it for years was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. Elias never lit the lantern again. He left it hanging on the porch as a reminder of the shadows it had cast and the lives it had touched. The villagers noticed the change too. Travelers who passed by the inn no longer spoke of eerie lights or whispered voices. The legend of the lantern faded into memory, a story told only in hushed tones by those who remembered. But on certain nights when the moon was high and the wind was still, some claimed to see a faint blue glow flickering in the distance, as though the lantern were casting its shadows one last time. In a small town nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside, there was a bridal boutique that had been in operation for nearly a century. The shop, called Eternal Vows, was renowned for its exquisite craftsmanship and its vast collection of vintage wedding dresses. Brides traveled from far and wide to find their perfect gown among the boutique's treasures. But hidden among the rows of lace and silk was one dress that no bride ever dared to wear, a dress shrouded in mystery and fear. This was the cursed wedding dress of Helena Gray. The story of the cursed dress began in 1897 with a young bride named Helena Gray. Helena was the daughter of a wealthy family, admired for her beauty and grace. She was set to marry Charles Ashford, a charming but ambitious man whose love for Helena was often overshadowed by his desire for her family's wealth. Helena's mother spared no expense in crafting the perfect wedding gown for her daughter. The dress was a masterpiece, an intricate creation of ivory satin and delicate lace, with a train that flowed like a river of moonlight. Its bodice was adorned with tiny pearls, and the veil shimmered with hand-sewn crystals. It was said to be a dress fit for royalty, but Helena's wedding day did not unfold as planned. As Helena walked down the aisle, the air grew heavy with unease. Guests whispered of an argument between the bride and groom the night before, and some claimed to have seen Helena crying in her dressing room. When it came time for the vows, Helena hesitated. Her voice faltered, her hands trembling as she held Charles's. "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the officiant asked. Helena looked at Charles, her eyes filled with sorrow. "No," she whispered. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Charles's face twisted with rage, and before anyone could react, he grabbed Helena by the arm and hissed, "You'll regret this." The ceremony was abruptly called off, and Helena fled the church in tears. That night, she was found dead in her room, still wearing her wedding dress. Some claimed it was heartbreak that killed her, while others whispered of darker forces at play. After Helena's death, her wedding dress was preserved as a keepsake by her grieving mother. But tragedy seemed to follow the gown wherever it went. The first victim was Helena's younger cousin, Margaret, who wore the dress for her own wedding 2 years later. On her wedding night, Margaret fell ill with a mysterious fever and died within days. Her death was sudden and unexplained, leaving the family in shock. The dress was returned to storage, but whispers of a curse began to circulate. Over the years, the gown was worn by other brides, each meeting a tragic end. One fell from a balcony on her honeymoon, another vanished without a trace, and one bride was struck by lightning during an outdoor ceremony. Each time the dress was returned to the Gray family, its reputation growing darker with every incident. By the 1930s, the dress had become an object of fear. Helena's descendants eventually sold it to a local collector, who donated it to Eternal Vows. It was displayed in the shop's back room, where it became more of a curiosity than a sale item. Decades passed, and the legend of the cursed wedding dress faded into obscurity. Most brides visiting Eternal Vows didn't even know it existed. But in 2023, a bride named Claire stumbled upon the gown while searching for a vintage dress. Claire was a practical woman, skeptical of superstition and drawn to the dress's undeniable beauty. She had never heard the stories of Helena Gray or the string of tragedies tied to the gown. To her, it was simply a stunning piece of history. Despite the shop owner's hesitation, Claire insisted on trying the dress. The moment she slipped it on, she felt a strange chill run through her body, but she dismissed it as nerves. The dress fit her perfectly, as though it had been made for her. "This is the one," she said with a radiant smile. The shop owner hesitated but ultimately sold Claire the dress. As Claire left the boutique, The owner whispered a silent prayer. In the weeks leading up to her wedding, Claire began to notice strange occurrences. Her reflection in the mirror seemed to linger a moment too long, her eyes shadowed with an expression she didn't recognize. At night, she dreamed of a young woman in a wedding dress, her face pale and tear-streaked. The night before the wedding, Claire woke to the sound of faint sobbing. She followed the sound to her closet, where the dress hung. The sobbing stopped the moment she opened the door, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Despite her unease, Claire convinced herself it was all in her head. On the day of her wedding, she put on the dress and tried to push the strange occurrences from her mind. But as she stood at the altar, something changed. The air grew cold, and the church seemed to darken. Claire felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though someone or something was watching her. When it came time for her vows, her voice faltered. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her chest and she collapsed. Claire survived, but her near-death experience led her to investigate the dress's history. She uncovered the story of Helena Gray and the string of tragedies tied to the gown. Determined to end the curse, Claire sought the help of a local historian and a spiritualist. Through their research, they discovered that Helena's death had not been accidental. Charles, enraged by her rejection, had poisoned her in a fit of jealousy. Her spirit, bound by betrayal and sorrow, had cursed the gown, dooming any bride who wore it. To break the curse, they needed to return the dress to Helena's resting place. On a moonlit night, Claire and her companions traveled to the old Gray family cemetery where Helena was buried. They placed the dress on her grave and lit a circle of candles around it. The spiritualist recited an incantation, calling for Helena's spirit to find peace. The air grew still, and the candles flickered as a faint figure appeared. A young woman in a wedding dress, her face no longer tear-streaked, but serene. She looked at Claire and smiled softly before fading into the night. The dress disintegrated into ash, leaving nothing behind but a faint scent of roses. After that night, the strange occurrences stopped. Claire went on to marry in a new dress, and her wedding was joyful and uneventful. The story of the cursed gown became a legend once more, a tale told to warn against the dangers of holding on to sorrow and betrayal. But in the back room of eternal vows, a single pearl from the gown remained, tucked away in a dusty box. And sometimes, when the light hit it just right, it seemed to shimmer with a faint, ghostly glow. At the edge of the small, fog-laden town of Coldwater, there was a stretch of road that locals avoided at all costs. Officially, it was called Holleridge Road, but everyone in town simply referred to it as the Black Stretch. The reason for its ominous nickname was simple. No matter how bright your headlights were, they would fail the moment you turned onto that road. Not dim, not flicker, fail completely, plunging you into an impenetrable darkness that swallowed everything. The legend of Holleridge Road had been passed down for decades. It was a shortcut, technically, shaving 15 miles off the trip to the neighboring town of Silverbrook. But for as long as anyone could remember, it was said to be cursed. Stories abounded of people who had taken the road at night and never returned. Their vehicles later found abandoned, with the engines cold, doors hanging open, and no sign of their drivers. Most people in Coldwater didn't dare to test the stories, but as with all small towns, there were always a few skeptics who couldn't resist the lure of a good ghost story, or the chance to disprove it. It was a crisp October evening when three friends decided to challenge the legend. Amy, Jake, and Tyler were college students home for the weekend, looking for something thrilling to break the monotony of their quiet hometown. Holleridge Road had always been a favorite topic of whispered conversations at bonfires and late-night hangouts, but none of them truly believed the tales. "It's just an old road," Jake said, leaning against his beat-up Jeep in the parking lot of the diner. "Probably bad wiring in the cars people used back then. Headlights failing isn't supernatural, it's electrical." Amy smirked, pulling her jacket tighter against the chilly breeze. And the people who disappeared? What, they just got tired of driving and walked off into the woods? Maybe, Jake shrugged. Or maybe they were just stories to scare kids like us. Tyler, the quietest of the group, hesitated. People say there's something in the dark out there. Something that doesn't like the light. Jake rolled his eyes. Oh, come on, you don't actually believe that, do you? Let's go. I'll prove it's all just urban legend. Amy hesitated, glancing at Tyler, but her curiosity got the better of her. Fine, let's do it. But if something creepy happens, we're turning back immediately. They piled into Jake's Jeep and drove out to the edge of town, where the trees grew taller and the streetlights grew fewer. By the time they reached the entrance to Hollow Ridge Road, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in deep blues and purples. The road itself was narrow and flanked by dense woods, the branches overhead creating a canopy that blocked out the stars. As Jake turned onto the black stretch, Amy felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The headlights dimmed almost immediately. See? Jake said, laughing nervously. Old wiring, no big deal. But as they continued, the headlights didn't just dim. They flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. Jake, this isn't funny, Amy said, her voice tight. I'm not doing anything, Jake snapped, flipping the switch for the high beams. Nothing happened. He hit the dashboard in frustration, but the lights remained dead. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the moon, but even that seemed muted, as if the darkness here was thicker, heavier than normal. We should turn back, Tyler said quietly from the back seat. Jake scoffed. It's just the lights. The engine's fine. We're already here. We might as well see how far it goes. Reluctantly, Amy stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The further they drove, the quieter it became. The hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires were the only sounds, but even those seemed muffled, as though the darkness was swallowing them. Then Amy saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Stop! She shouted, grabbing Jake's arm. He slammed on the brakes, and the Jeep skidded to a halt. The figure didn't move. It was tall and shadowy, its features indistinct in the dim light. What the hell is that? Jake muttered, his bravado slipping. Go around it, Tyler whispered. Jake tried, steering the Jeep to the side, but as soon as they moved, the figure seemed to dissolve into the air, reappearing a moment later, directly in their path. That's it. We're leaving, Amy said, her voice shaking. Jake nodded, throwing the Jeep into reverse. But as they backed up, the road seemed to stretch endlessly behind them, the woods closing in on either side. That's not possible, Jake muttered, glancing at the rearview mirror. Amy turned to look out the back window, her breath caught in her throat. Jake, drive, now! What? Why? Just drive, she screamed. In the distance behind them, more figures were appearing, dozens of them, emerging from the woods and moving toward the car. Jake slammed on the gas, but the Jeep's tires spun uselessly on the gravel. The engine sputtered, and then, inexplicably, it died. The figures grew closer, their shapes becoming more defined. They weren't people, not exactly. Their forms were twisted, their limbs elongated, and their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Amy fumbled for her phone, but the screen was black, unresponsive. Tyler tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. We're trapped, he whispered. The figures surrounded the car, their faces inches from the windows. One pressed a hand against the glass, leaving behind a smear of darkness that seemed to seep into the Jeep's interior. Amy closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She thought of her family, of everything she'd never get to say or do. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the figures vanished. The engine roared back to life, and the headlights flickered on. Jake didn't hesitate. He floored the gas pedal, the Jeep lurching forward as the road finally began to look familiar again. When they emerged onto the main highway, none of them spoke. The oppressive darkness lifted, but the memory of what they had seen lingered. They never spoke of the black stretch again. Jake sold the Jeep within a week, unable to sit behind the wheel without hearing the faint whispers from that night. Amy avoided driving altogether, and Tyler left town for good, choosing to bury the memory in the distance. The legend of Holleridge Road lived on, but the three of them knew the truth. The road didn't just make headlights fail, it made everything fail. Logic, light, hope. And in the darkest corners of their minds, they knew the figures were still there, waiting for the next traveler who dared to venture into the endless black. The old Ashcroft Manor loomed at the edge of town like a decaying sentinel, its pointed gables and cracked windows giving it the appearance of a Gothic crown. For decades it had been abandoned, its once manicured gardens now choked with weeds and brambles. Few dared to approach it, and even fewer would speak of the strange events rumored to have taken place there. But for Margaret Maggie Greer, the manor represented opportunity. Maggie was an antiques dealer, always on the hunt for rare and valuable items to sell to her clients. When she heard that the manor's current owner, a reclusive man named Edwin Hartwell, was selling its contents before demolishing the house, Maggie knew she had to visit. Stories of hauntings didn't scare her. They only added to the allure. What she didn't expect was the centerpiece of her visit, a massive crystal chandelier hanging in the grand foyer. Maggie received the invitation in the form of a handwritten note, delivered to her shop by a courier. It was an elegant thing, written in precise, looping handwriting on thick parchment paper. Ms. Greer, you are cordially invited to Ashcroft Manor to inspect and bid on its remaining antiques. Please arrive by noon on Saturday. Do not linger after nightfall. The warning struck her as odd, but Maggie chalked it up to superstition. She had heard the rumors about the manor, of course. Whispers of ghosts and curses, of screams heard in the night. But she was a woman of logic, not folklore. So on Saturday morning, she packed her ledger and notebook, grabbed her camera, and set off for Ashcroft Manor. The manor was more imposing up close. Its weathered facade seemed to glare down at her as she approached the massive oak doors. Edwin Hartwell, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and pale eyes, greeted her with a curt nod. "The items are yours to inspect," he said, leading her into the grand foyer. "Take what you wish, but," his voice faltered, "be gone before nightfall." Maggie dismissed his warning with a polite smile and turned her attention to the room. Dust motes danced in the beams of light streaming through the cracked windows, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Her eyes were immediately drawn to the chandelier. It was enormous, its countless crystals sparkling like frozen teardrops. The wrought iron frame was intricately carved with twisting vines and tiny faces, their expressions frozen in what looked like agony. Despite the grime coating the rest of the room, the chandelier gleamed, as if it had been polished recently. "Magnificent," Maggie murmured, stepping beneath it. But as she gazed up, she felt a faint chill crawl down her spine. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the faces carved into the frame moved, their expressions shifting ever so slightly. She shook off the feeling and began taking notes. As the day wore on, Maggie explored the rest of the manor, cataloging ornate furniture, gilded mirrors, and faded tapestries. But nothing compared to the chandelier. "Is it for sale?" she asked Edwin as they stood in the foyer. He hesitated. You don't want it. Why not?" "There's something wrong with it," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Every night at midnight, it drips blood." Maggie blinked, unsure if he was serious. "Blood? You're joking." "I wish I were," he said. "It's cursed. My family tried to remove it once, but..." His voice trailed off and his gaze shifted to the floor. "It's better left alone." But Maggie didn't believe in curses. She believed in profit. "I'll take it," she said. Edwin stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and pity. "You don't understand? I'll take it," she repeated firmly. The chandelier was delivered to Maggie's shop that evening. She instructed her assistant James to install it in the showroom, ignoring his protests about the eerie faces carved into the frame. "It's just an antique," she said. "Nothing to worry about." That night, as the clock struck midnight, Maggie woke to a faint dripping sound. At first, she thought it was rain, but when she glanced out the window, the sky was clear. The sound was coming from the showroom. Curious, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way downstairs. The chandelier hung in the center of the room, its crystals gleaming in the moonlight. But as Maggie stepped closer, she froze. Dark red droplets were falling from the chandelier, splattering onto the polished wooden floor. Her heart raced as she raised the flashlight. The liquid dripped from the carved faces, pooling in tiny streams that trickled down the iron frame. The smell of iron filled the air. Maggie staggered back, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. "It's not possible," she whispered. The faces on the chandelier seemed to shift, their mouths opening in silent screams. The next day, Maggie scrubbed the floor clean and convinced herself it was some kind of prank. Perhaps Edwin had rigged the chandelier to drip something as a way to scare her. But the following night, it happened again, and the night after that. By the end of the week, Maggie was exhausted. She hadn't slept, her dreams plagued by visions of the chandelier and the faces carved into its frame. She began to notice other strange occurrences, faint whispers when she was alone, shadows that moved in the corners of her vision. Desperate for answers, she began researching the history of Ashcroft Manor and its cursed chandelier. Maggie discovered that the chandelier had been commissioned by the first owner of Ashcroft Manor, a man named Silas Ashcroft. A wealthy merchant, Silas had been obsessed with immortality. He hired a reclusive artist to craft the chandelier, instructing him to embed it with powerful symbols and rituals. But the artist was no ordinary craftsman. He was a practitioner of dark magic, and the chandelier became a vessel for his experiments. The faces carved into its frame were said to be the souls of those Silas had wronged. Servants, rivals, even his own family members. Their blood was used to power the rituals, and when Silas died, the chandelier became cursed, a relic of his cruelty. By the time Maggie finished her research, she was at her breaking point. She couldn't sell the chandelier, not after what she had learned, but she couldn't keep it either. Determined to break the curse, she decided to destroy it. She waited until midnight when the dripping began. Armed with a sledgehammer, she stood beneath the chandelier, her hands trembling. The faces stared down at her, their expressions twisted with anger and despair. "I'm ending this," she said through gritted teeth. She swung the hammer, shattering one of the crystals. A piercing scream echoed through the room, and a wave of cold air knocked her off her feet. The faces on the chandelier began to writhe, their mouths opening and closing in silent agony. Blood poured from the iron frame, pooling around Maggie as she struggled to stand. With one final swing, she struck the base of the chandelier. The entire structure collapsed, the crystals shattering into 1,000 pieces. When the police arrived the next morning, they found Maggie unconscious on the floor of her shop. The chandelier was gone, reduced to a pile of broken glass and twisted metal. Maggie woke in the hospital, her memories hazy. She told the police it had been an accident, but deep down she knew the truth. The curse was broken, but it had come at a cost. For weeks after, she dreamed of the faces in the chandelier, their anguished cries echoing in her mind. And though the chandelier was gone, Maggie could never escape the feeling that its curse still lingered, watching her from the shadows. The legend of the liminal trail was one of whispers and fireside tales, spoken of by travelers and hermits alike. It was said to appear only to those who were truly lost, those who had wandered too far, strayed too deeply, or had nowhere left to turn. The stories differed on what awaited at the trail's end. Some claimed it led to safety, a refuge for the weary. Others believed it was a trick, a path to oblivion that preyed on the desperate. Eleanor Gray didn't believe in such tales, not until the day she found herself standing at the entrance to the trail, her breath fogging in the chill air, her heart pounding with equal parts fear and hope. Eleanor was a seasoned hiker, no stranger to the wilderness. She had spent years exploring remote trails, documenting her journeys for her blog and her growing audience. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a solo trek through the Silver Pine Forest, a place known for its dense woods and misty valleys. The first 2 days were uneventful, filled with the soothing sounds of birdsong and the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. But on the third day, a storm rolled in without warning. The skies turned an ominous gray, and rain began to pour in relentless sheets. Her map quickly became useless, the ink smudged and illegible. The GPS on her phone was no help either, the signal lost in the vast wilderness. Eleanor tried to retrace her steps, but the storm had turned familiar paths into muddy, unrecognizable terrain. By the time the rain stopped, the sun was setting, and Eleanor realized she was hopelessly lost. As darkness fell, Eleanor found herself standing in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to close in on her. The air was unnaturally still, the usual sounds of the forest, chirping insects, rustling leaves, conspicuously absent. She lit her lantern and tried to calm her racing thoughts. That's when she saw it. A trail stretched before her, cutting through the dense trees. It hadn't been there moments before. She was certain of it. The path was narrow, lined with stones that glowed faintly in the dim light. Eleanor hesitated. There was something otherworldly about the trail, something that sent a shiver down her spine. But what choice did she have? She was lost, and this trail, this strange, sudden trail, was the only sign of direction she had. Gripping her lantern tightly, she stepped onto the path. The trail wound deeper into the forest, its glowing stones casting an eerie, pale light. As she walked, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows shifted in the periphery of her vision, and every so often, she thought she heard whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath her feet. The forest around her seemed to change as she walked. The trees grew taller and older, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the stars. Moss and vines covered the trunks, and the air grew colder with each step. Time felt strange on the trail. Hours seemed to pass in the blink of an eye, while minutes stretched into eternity. Eleanor's watch had stopped working, and her lantern never dimmed, no matter how long she walked. As the trail twisted and turned, the whispers grew louder. They began to form words, though Eleanor wished they hadn't. "You're lost," one voice hissed, low and mournful. "Turn back," another warned, its tone sharp and urgent. "This is not your path," a third voice said, filled with sorrow. Eleanor tried to ignore them, focusing on the path ahead. But the voices persisted, their tones shifting between anger, pity, and pleading. "Why are you here?" one voice asked, so close it made her jump. "I don't know," Eleanor shouted, her voice echoing through the forest. "I'm lost. I just want to go home." The whispers fell silent. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then a single voice spoke, soft and calm. "Then follow and see where the path takes you." The trail eventually led Eleanor to a crossroads, a place where 3 paths diverged. At the center of the crossroads stood a tree unlike any she had ever seen. Its bark was silver, and its branches glowed with a soft, golden light. Beneath the tree was a pool of water, perfectly still and reflecting the starless sky above. Eleanor approached the tree cautiously. As she drew closer, the water in the pool began to ripple, and images appeared on its surface. The first image showed a warm, cozy cabin nestled in a snowy valley. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a figure stood at the door, waving to her. It was a vision of safety, a place where she could rest and recover. The second image showed a bustling city street filled with familiar landmarks. It was her home, her life before she became lost. The third image showed the trail continuing into the forest, disappearing into darkness. A voice spoke, this time from the tree itself. "Three paths lie before you," it said, its tone deep and resonant. "Choose wisely, for your choice cannot be undone." Eleanor stared at the images, her mind racing. The cabin was tempting, so tempting. She was exhausted, cold and scared, and the thought of a safe haven was almost too much to resist. But something about it felt final, like a place where she would remain forever. The vision of home tugged at her heart. It was what she wanted most, wasn't it? To return to her life, her friends, and her family. But the third path, the continuation of the trail, called to her in a different way. It was unknown, mysterious, and possibly dangerous. Yet it felt like the only path that truly belonged to her. After a long moment, Eleanor made her choice. She stepped onto the third path. The trail grew darker as she walked, the glowing stones fading to a dim flicker. The forest seemed to close in around her, the air thick with an otherworldly presence. Finally, the trail ended, opening into another clearing. At its center was a mirror, tall and framed in gold. Eleanor approached it cautiously, her reflection staring back at her. But the reflection wasn't quite right. It looked like her, but older, wiser, and with a calmness in her eyes that Eleanor didn't feel. The reflection spoke. "You were never lost," it said. "You were searching, and now you've found what you need." "I don't understand," Eleanor said. "The trail appears to the lost," the reflection said. "But being lost is not about where you are. It's about who you are. This path has shown you the truth of yourself. You are stronger than you think, braver than you know, and ready to face whatever lies ahead." The mirror shimmered and the reflection vanished. When Eleanor stepped out of the clearing, she found herself back at the edge of the moors. The storm was gone, the sun rising over the horizon. She looked behind her, but the trail was nowhere to be seen. Eleanor smiled, a sense of peace settling over her. She wasn't lost anymore, not in the moors and not in her life. The trail had shown her the way forward, even if it wasn't the path she had expected. And though she never found the trail again, she carried its lessons with her, knowing that sometimes the only way to find yourself is to lose your way first. It began with a whisper. Travelers along lonely highways spoke of a strange town that wasn't on any map, a place that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The stories were always the same, a cluster of weathered buildings, dimly lit streets, and a strange sense of stillness that lingered in the air. Locals from neighboring towns called it Willow Shade, though no one seemed to know why. The town wasn't fixed. It moved every night, vanishing as the sun rose and reappearing miles away. To most, the stories were nothing more than urban legends, tales to scare young wanderers. But for those who had seen Willow Shade, the experience was unforgettable and haunting. Lena Morgan first heard about Willow Shade during her shift at the roadside diner where she worked as a waitress. It was late, and the place was nearly empty, save for a trucker nursing a cup of black coffee and a slice of pie. He was a regular, always coming through town on his cross-country routes. "You ever heard of a town that just shows up?" he asked casually, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. "A ghost town?" Lena asked, smirking as she wiped down the counter. "Not exactly. It's real. Streets, houses, people and all. But it ain't always in the same place. I saw it once. Pulled off the road at night to take a break, and there it was, like it had always been there. But by morning, it was gone. Thought I was losing my mind till I heard others talking about it." Lena laughed. "You've been driving too long. Probably dreamed it. The trucker shook his head. I ain't the only one. You ask around, you'll hear the same thing. But I'll tell you this, if you ever find it, don't stay too long. Folks say it doesn't let everyone leave. That night as Lena drove home, the trucker's words stuck with her. She told herself it was just a story, but part of her, a small, curious part, wanted to see this phantom town for herself. 2 weeks later, Lena was driving home from a late shift. The highway stretched endlessly before her, bathed in the pale glow of her headlights. The radio crackled faintly, unable to hold a signal, and the surrounding darkness felt thicker than usual. Then she saw it. Up ahead, where she was certain there had only been empty fields the night before, there were now lights. Street lights, faint and flickering, lined a narrow road that seemed to lead into a small town. Her pulse quickened. The trucker's story flooded her mind. Curiosity got the better of her. She slowed her car and turned onto the road, the tires crunching over gravel. The air felt different here, heavier, colder. As she drove deeper into the town, she saw rows of old-fashioned buildings, their windows glowing with soft, golden light. A diner, a general store, a post office, all the hallmarks of a quaint, forgotten town. The streets were empty, but everything looked meticulously maintained. Fresh paint on the buildings, flower boxes brimming with vibrant blooms, and not a single sign of decay. It was as if the town had been frozen in time. Lena parked her car outside the diner and stepped out, her breath visible in the chilly night air. The door to the diner swung open with a faint creak, as if inviting her in. Against her better judgment, she crossed the threshold. The diner was immaculate. Chrome stools gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, though no music played. A woman in a pale blue uniform stood behind the counter, wiping a glass. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Welcome to Willowshade," she said. Her voice was pleasant, but something about her tone unsettled Lena. "Hi," Lena said, forcing a smile. "This place, it wasn't here yesterday." The woman tilted her head. "Willowshade moves around. It has a way of finding those who need it." "Need it?" Lena echoed. I wasn't looking for it." The woman's smile didn't falter. "Sometimes it's the other way around. Can I get you something? Coffee? Pie?" Lena hesitated but nodded. "Coffee, please." As the woman poured a steaming cup, Lena glanced around the room. The booths were empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The woman set the coffee in front of her. "You might not remember everything, but Willowshade remembers you." "What does that mean?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression softened. "Everyone who comes here has a past, something they've left behind, something they're running from. Willowshade has a way of showing people what they need to see." Before Lena could respond, the door swung open. A man stumbled in, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "They're coming!" the man gasped, his voice shaking. "They always come." The woman behind the counter didn't seem alarmed. She simply nodded and gestured for the man to sit. He collapsed into a booth, clutching his head. Lena turned to the woman. "What's going on? Who's coming?" The woman sighed. "Willowshade isn't just a town. It's a place between places. And sometimes things follow those who find it." "What things?" Lena asked, her heart racing. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she looked at Lena with piercing eyes. "You should leave before sunrise. If you stay too long, the town won't let you go." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She grabbed her coat and hurried outside. But as she stepped onto the street, she froze. The town had changed. Buildings that had been neat and orderly were now crumbling and covered in vines. The warm glow of the streetlights had turned into a sickly green hue. Shadows moved in the alleys, slinking closer with every passing second. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, echoing in Lena's ears. She turned back to the diner. but the door was gone, replaced by a solid brick wall. Panic set in. Lena ran down the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The town seemed to shift around her, the streets twisting and turning like a living maze. No matter which direction she ran, she couldn't find her car. The whispers grew louder, forming words now. "You can't leave. You belong here," Lena screamed, clutching her head as the shadows closed in. But just as she felt herself slipping into despair, she saw it. The narrow gravel road she had driven in on, stretching out toward the highway. With every ounce of strength she had left, she sprinted toward it. The shadows lunged after her, their cold, claw-like fingers brushing against her back. But she didn't stop. She ran until she burst onto the highway, collapsing in the middle of the road. When she looked back, Willowshade was gone. Lena never told anyone what had happened that night. The trucker's story had been true, and she had barely escaped with her life. But the experience left her with more questions than answers. Why had the town appeared to her? What had it meant when the woman said Willowshade remembered her? And what would have happened if she hadn't escaped before sunrise? Months later, she heard another story, this time from a stranger at the diner. They spoke of a mysterious town that appeared and disappeared, a place that showed people their greatest fears and regrets. Lena said nothing, but deep down, she knew the truth. Willowshade wasn't just a phantom town. It was a reflection of the soul, a place that exposed what was hidden and forced its visitors to confront the darkest corners of their hearts. And somewhere, out there in the shifting darkness, it was still waiting. The ring was discovered in a dusty box at the back of an antique shop on a dreary November afternoon. It was a simple thing at first glance, an old silver band, tarnished with age, with a small black stone embedded in its center. The stone shimmered faintly, as if catching a light that no one else could see. Catherine Reynolds, a curious collector of oddities and heirlooms, stumbled upon it while browsing the shop during her weekend stroll. The shopkeeper, a wiry old man with a hunchback and piercing gray eyes, seemed reluctant to sell it. "That ring isn't like the others," he said cryptically as she examined it. Catherine smiled politely. "I don't mind. It has character." The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It shows truths best left buried. Be certain before you take it." Catherine, used to the theatrics of antique dealers trying to inflate the value of their wares, chuckled and handed him the money. "I think I'll take my chances." That evening, Catherine sat in her cozy apartment, turning the ring over in her hands. The stone seemed to pulse faintly under the soft glow of her desk lamp, almost as if it were alive. On a whim, she slipped it onto her finger. The metal was icy cold, sending a shiver up her spine, but it fit perfectly, as though it had been made for her. At first, nothing happened. Catherine laughed at herself for indulging in the old shopkeeper's ominous warnings. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ring, admiring how the black stone caught the light in strange, mesmerizing ways. Then the room grew cold. The warmth of her apartment seemed to drain away, replaced by a creeping chill that sank into her bones. Catherine sat up, her breath visible in the air, her heart pounding. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. Catherine recognized her immediately. It was Alice, her childhood best friend, the same Alice she had betrayed years ago. "No," Catherine whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But the figure stepped closer, and Catherine could hear her voice, faint and accusing. "Why did you do it, Cat? Why did you lie?" Memories flooded Catherine's mind. She had stolen something from Alice once, a small act of jealousy that had spiraled into a devastating fallout. Alice had never recovered, and the guilt had haunted Catherine ever since. The apparition lingered for what felt like hours before fading into the shadows, leaving Catherine trembling and gasping for breath. The next day, Catherine couldn't bring herself to take off the ring. Despite the terror of the night before, she felt strangely compelled to keep it on. She told herself it was just her imagination, a trick of her subconscious, but deep down she knew better. The ring didn't just reveal secrets, it forced her to confront them. At work, her colleagues noticed her distraction. Her boss, Mr. Larkin, called her into his office to discuss an overdue project. As he spoke, Catherine felt the familiar chill creeping over her. Suddenly, Mr. Larkin froze mid-sentence, his face pale. His eyes darted to the ring on her finger, and then he began to speak, not to Catherine, but to the empty space beside her. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he stammered, his voice shaking. "It was an accident. I swear." Catherine turned, horrified, and saw the faint outline of a young woman standing beside her. She didn't recognize the figure, but her presence was heavy, filled with sorrow and accusation. When the vision faded, Mr. Larkin slumped into his chair, his head in his hands. "What is that thing?" he whispered, staring at Catherine's ring with wide, terrified eyes. Catherine began to experiment with the ring, trying to understand its power. She discovered that it didn't just reveal her secrets, it revealed the darkest truths of anyone near her. Friends, strangers, even passers-by on the street. No one was immune. She learned of betrayals, regrets, and hidden sins. One woman in the grocery store broke down sobbing, confessing to a crime she had kept buried for decades. A man at the coffee shop stormed out after the vision of his estranged brother appeared, accusing him of abandonment. The ring seemed to feed on these moments, its black stone glowing brighter with each revelation. Catherine felt its pull more strongly every day, as though it had a will of its own. But the more she wore it, the more it took from her. Catherine began to notice changes in herself. Her reflection in the mirror looked older, more gaunt. Her eyes, once bright and curious, were now sunken and shadowed. The ring was consuming her, devouring her energy, her very soul. But she couldn't take it off. Every time she tried, the band seemed to tighten, burning her skin. The whispers in her mind grew louder, urging her to keep wearing it, to uncover more secrets. One night, unable to sleep, she sat in her dimly lit living room, staring at the ring. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The flame of the candle on her coffee table flickered violently, and the room grew cold once more. This time, the figure that appeared wasn't a stranger. It was her mother. Her mother who had died when Catherine was a teenager. Her mother whose final moments had been filled with anger and disappointment over an argument they'd never resolved. Tears streamed down Catherine's face as the ghostly figure stared at her, silent but filled with unspoken words. The weight of guilt and regret crushed her chest, and she fell to her knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." But the figure only watched, fading away as the room grew warmer again. Catherine knew she couldn't keep the ring any longer. It was destroying her, piece by piece. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't remove it. Desperate, she returned to the antique shop, hoping the shopkeeper might have answers. But when she arrived, the shop was empty. Dust coated the counters and cobwebs hung from the shelves, as though no one had been there for years. She searched the shop, her heart racing, until she found a small note tucked beneath the counter. It read, "The ring reveals what is hidden, but the truth is a heavy burden. To be free, you must face your own darkness." Catherine stared at the note, her mind racing. She had already faced so many secrets, so much guilt. What more could the ring want from her? That night, she sat alone in her apartment, the ring heavy on her finger. She lit a candle and stared into its flame, letting the memories come. All the lies, the betrayals, the pain she had caused over the years. She didn't turn away, didn't try to deny them. As the hours passed, the black stone on the ring began to dim. The whispers faded, and the chill in the air dissipated. Finally, as dawn broke, The ring loosened on her finger, sliding off as easily as if it had never been stuck. Catherine placed it on the table and stared at it for a long time. She didn't know what to do with it, whether to destroy it or hide it away. In the end, she wrapped it in cloth and locked it in a small wooden box. She buried the box deep in the woods, vowing to leave it behind forever. But sometimes late at night, she could still feel the weight of the ring on her finger, and she wondered if it was truly gone, or if it was simply waiting for someone else to find it.